Hi there, my name's Ben. I'm neurodiverse. The title of this video is Autism, ADHD and the Joy of Tangents. So I think it is therefore logical to begin with a tangent, for I'm aware that this script is peppered with references to dopamine. However, please know that I was only aware that I had ADHD alongside my other neurodiverse conditions in 2024, and thus I'm still in something of a honeymoon period regarding it, so to speak. Also, obviously, but importantly, it seems to my current estimation that anyone who has been aware that they have had ADHD for several years will probably deem writing about the love of dopamine as even sub-preliminary, sub the basics, sub frankly the blinking obvious. However, although I am still in the ADHD honeymoon period, nevertheless, I'm convinced that chasing dopamine is probably a lifelong affliction, source of pleasure, and should be endured and enjoyed, criticized, and celebrated for those very reasons. Additionally, however, there are several videos on YouTube about the only recently coined term ADHD, which renders the ADHD issues even more complex and problematical, and yet, debatably in some contexts, also more joyful, as a direct consequence of the factoring into the general equation of the autism factor, so to speak. At any rate, in my passionate opinion, all the ADHD videos currently on YouTube, such as the Great Purple Ella, the Great Yosemite Sam, and the Great Kenny's videos, are compelling, erudite, and timely. However, and I'm aware this might be controversial to some, for all their bountiful merits, few, if any, of these videos exhibit an unashamedly unbounded celebration and showcase for the sometimes seeming sheer joy of quite what it is like to be both autistic and ADHD, vis-a-vis the sheer joy of going off on tangents, which is debatably a fairly benignly unavoidable aspect of the dual condition. Indeed, and again, but for different reasons, this may be controversial to some viewers. One of the aims of this video is to argue that people who have autism and ADHD, as well as other conditions, might be able to become neurodiverse role models, neurodiverse influencers of sorts. See later in this video in like 2.5 hours' time. No, it's only about half an hour. So the patient viewers of this video are embarking on a very long journey to get to the end of the thing. The fact that I've written such a long script might have caused a specific connotation in the viewer's mind that I'm some kind of long-term wannabe writer. Well, such a supposition would be a correct one, to tell the truth. Which brings me to my next point. Indeed constitutes my latest tangent, for many people intuitively, ironically enough, associate writing with very specific artistic forms such as novels. However, now, another disclaimer, I've tried hard to write a novel over the years, although frankly, I've found that perhaps the genre of writing that I'm most suited to is the informal essay. I mean, of course, there is a formal aspect within most informal essays worthy of the name. By God, the patient viewer will be bemused, amused, maybe even inspired, by the amount of scrupulous, zany London Review of Books references in this script. But paradoxically and dialectically, as that great novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky brings matters to a close at the end of his preface to his 1880 novel The Brothers Karamazov. But now, to business. First of all then, what exactly is that infamous bogeyman, a tangent? Well, luckily for the patient viewer, this video will seek to, in yet another historical example of someone achieving the seemingly paradoxically impossible, namely, to achieve via the narrative route of a series of interconnected tangents, to via this very route reach the final destination theme and final destination conclusion concerning what exactly a tangent is. And with that task having been dispatched so that one's wannabe neurodiverse influencer bucket list of potential video themes is rendered a little less heavy, perhaps, at least to a certain extent, a small but valuable contribution will have been made by this video to the exploration and exhibition of quite what it is like to be autistic and ADHD. And so, now, naturally, and all according to plan, I assure you, another tangent. Piece of writing from 2023 I will go on in this video to sample the novella Fascinating Peculiarities. Showcases, I think, a rightly scenario where my autism to a large extent keeps my ADHD in check. However, a Facebook wall post from 2024 demonstrates what exciting, yet alas partially harebrained zany things can happen when my autism is unable to keep the ADHD in check. In other words, it's open season for perpetually chasing dopamine in a manner not constrained by any visible law. And yet, because I'm proud to have ADHD as one of my 5 conditions, autism, dyspraxia, ADHD, OCD, and bipolar disorder, I see this as an example of what in Thomas Armstrong's 2010 book, The Power of Neurodiversity, is called the joy of the hyperactive brain. Indeed, the London Review of Books made reference in a 1980 piece to the candy store phraseology of Kurt Weill's songs, i.e., in other words, what Kurt Weill's songs were bittersweet in sonic character. However, perhaps it is true to say that the dopamine chasing ADHD often pushes you towards sweet things, saccharine things even. However, to put it in other words, in his great underrated book, How to Read a Poem, literary critic Terry Eagleton argues that while he highly values John Keats's poem On the Eve of St. Agnes, nevertheless, he notes that some critics have compared it somewhat disparagingly to baby food. But when I read Keats's poem earlier this year, I felt that although it could be negatively compared to baby food if you were being cynical and joyless, nevertheless, it was more saccharine in the sense of the sweet mental sensation of the dopamine seeking ADHD aspects of one's mind, so to speak. Indeed, it follows that ADHD induced tangents can sometimes be, when regarded in a more positive light, an example of what, in the case of Eric Hobsbawm, the Guardian's obituarist Martin Kettle called his powers of synthesis. Of course, Eric Hobsbawm was a genius, and his powers of synthesis, when engaging in his particular niche, history, were obviously but importantly definable as bona fide genius in character. However, in my own autistic ADHD version of what in the key book on autism, Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism, How to Think Smarter About People Who Think Differently, is called a contemplative order of one, perhaps sympathizing in the mind such hitherto disparate items as the LRB in 1980 referring to the candy store bittersweet nature of Kurt Weill's music on the one hand, and Terry Eagleton's noting of the alleged baby food aspect of John Keats's poem, The Eve of St. Agnes, on the other, is my very own best attempt at a truly Hobsbawmian intellectual act of synthesis. Indeed, in a previous piece of writing on Facebook, I referenced both Friedrich Engels' often utilized line in the final analysis as being what Max Weber would call a polar concept, vis-a-vis Jack Kerouac's sometimes celebrated, sometimes disparaged compositional dictum, first thought, best thought. After all, campus novel specialist David Lodge, during his Henry James hat-tipping literary essay collection The Art of Fiction, has a chapter called Hemingway and Repetition. And, as if this wasn't enough, and proving that attempting the best intellectual synthesis one can muster is akin to attempting to embark on numerous tangents to the best of one's intellectually disabled abilities, here benignly rears up into the old conceptual semantic field, so to speak, that underrated Smith's lyric, "It was dark as I drove the point home," which in turn relates to that early moment in Philip Larkin's poem, The Whitsun Weddings. That Whitsun, I was late getting away. I used to stay up late writing letters to several friends in 2010, and found it a pleasing compositional medium, one far easier than writing an entire novel, say. Quite how such epistolary novels as The Prison of Love are completed satisfactorily and published without explicit two-person collaboration, however, is beyond me. Hopefully this YouTube video and future YouTube videos of mine, by the way, like and subscribe please, thanks, can, by catalyzing into enhanced motion, hopefully at least one recondite corner of the internet, help with answering that question also. Indeed, Oscar Wilde, in one of his letters, says, like a young god. I used to joke on Facebook posts about the potential comic correspondence between this line and good old Magnus Magnuson's deservedly renowned phrase, I've started, so I'll finish. I suppose once you've started creating an entire universe, it's rather hard to stop. However, I am no celestial figure. My creative contributions are probably deserving of no label less disparaging than, say, a dog's dinner. And yet, as Samuel Johnson once said, and yet I have hope. A lot of my writing has an autobiographical character to it. Jack Kerouac's On the Road is one of the most famous roman à clefs ever written. Indeed, the literary works of the Beat Generation were described by some in the 1970s as being akin to the new journalism of the 1970s, albeit 20 years earlier. Indeed, being both someone who among his many influences counts the new journalism of the 1970s and the Beat Generation of the 1950s, if at some yet forever put off stage in my dream career of the near future, I was to do that simultaneously most normative and deviant thing and participate in a podcast, patience being a virtue and all that jazz, well, the Indian cricket player Jasprit Bumrah would almost certainly be at the top of my list. I was on the phone to my adopted dad, Mark Francis, the other day, and I had another epiphany. And I said, cool, Dad, just think what if we could somehow get Bumrah as childhood cricket coach on the podcast. Then I could ask him how the hell the peculiar developmental transition occurred, where the young Bumrah developed the utterly perplexing technical skill of starting his bowling run-up as if he's going to bowl a slow spin ball on a moderate run-up, then flailing his arms around into the bargain. And then once he gets to what the cricket boffins, still to my knowledge, call the popping crease, fucking geeks, then deliver a full-on fast-paced delivery to the batsman, clocking in at around 90 miles per hour. Indeed, it perhaps could even have the potential to break veritable paradigms, a priceless, palpable process the great philosopher of science Thomas S. Kuhn laid out long ago in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Indeed, during the excellent podcast hosted by Marina Hyde and Richard Osman, Adam Curtis on the BBC Politics and AI, guest Adam Curtis says that going on his experience, he sincerely thinks that, in a final analysis, academia refuses to allow people to be imaginative. This is then potentially another starting point for exploring the creative permutations flowing from that moment in the BBC documentary Inside Einstein's Mind, namely, Einstein's unique skills can be summed up in his ability to place an equal sign in between two hitherto disparate pieces of information, as I'll hopefully convincingly explain and demonstrate soon. At any rate, the great Adam Curtis is, going on the aforesaid evidence, rather like a latter-day Einstein. I, however, am like a more intellectually ambitious Carl Pilkington. However, I'm still able to dimly analytically perceive that Curtis's podcast and this entire video hopefully brings up the idea of that ongoing debate. Is TikTok or YouTube a more fruitful human domain for creative possibilities to emerge in the interdisciplinary midst of the age-old dialectic between high culture and low culture? Of course, although feel free to disagree with me on either platform, often it is best to attempt to have the best of both worlds. The philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, after all, at one point in his oeuvre talks about mutually fructifying phenomena. Indeed, to give some empirical evidence from my own experience that powerfully backs up Adam Curtis's thesis that academia refuses to allow people to be imaginative, well, I was told by a tutor at Sheffield Hallam University in 2022 that the act of writing a top grade requiring academic essay should be, and I quote verbatim, like leading a toddler through a landscape. What the fuck? No offence to toddlers, but Einstein said, in difficulty lies opportunity. Go figure. But all this is lost to many of the still tediously long-term tenured academics. Or, as David Foster Wallace says in one YouTube video, it's all bullshit anyway. And as if this wasn't enough, in 2025, AI only makes this monstrous lack of intellectual ambition worse. And yet, in that same documentary, Adam Curtis talks about bringing out your inner DJ. Well, I can be sympathetic with people who say things like, "Oh, I don't like philosophy. It is, after all, an acquired taste," as my adopted dad Mark Francis would say. And he, after all, once studied at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London in the 1970s. However, I once met someone who literally said, "Oh, I don't like music." What the fuck? Anyway, this aforesaid line of bringing out your inner DJ relates, I think, to Million Dead's song Living the Dream, and especially to that what G.K. Chesterton would probably call an elemental climax, namely those lyrical moments during that song, which sharply describe how, despite all the significant sympathies with many burning, tragic social causes the world over, which usually capture one's affections, the clue is in the band's names, folks. Nevertheless, that feeling of bringing out one's inner DJ, in whatever social context, well, it doesn't get much better than that. Which brings me nicely to another point. Is it okay to sometimes finish allegedly serious arguments with selected snippets from music lyrics? Well, again, did not Adam Curtis in that particular podcast say that contemporary academia often, sadly, even stubbornly, inculcates a lack of imagination? Well, they certainly don't allow you to quote pop lyrics in your university essays, wherever you were to attempt such an impish stunt. However much doing so would prove that the essay hadn't been produced by an acne-harassed 18-year-old who'd studied so hard that they jump-started ideas for the beginning, middle and end of their essay by simply clicking a few buttons and letting AI do the large majority of the rest. Now that's intelligence. Which brings me nicely back round to Adam Curtis' podcast again. I mean to say, Adam Curtis rightly says, I think, that the problem with many BBC documentaries on the Thatcher years, over the years, is that it was an unfortunate feature of them that they would invariably finish a certain documentary montage to the accompaniment of the special song Ghost Town. Which brings me nicely on to another point, if anyone is still watching. And look, if you are, then why look so surprised that the video does what it says on the title? ADHD, Autism, and the Joy of Tangents. Indeed, seeking even more dopamine, we can say that teenagers today invariably won't get references to what my 38-year-old self can get. For latest example, the 1990s Ronsel advert. It does what it says on the tin, which, to take off on another tangent, and why not, seeing as how, for all his flaws, Jack Kerouac was debatably onto something when he articulated his strange recurring psychological needs, desirous for everything at the same time, or, as William Wordsworth said in also exalted fashion, this time after having tasted the sheer everything is possible, heady atmosphere ubiquitously palpable during the Great French Revolution of 1789. Bliss was it to be alive in that dawn, but to be young was very heaven. Speaking of all things desirous of everything at the same time, related, well, that key moment in that key album, My Sonic Youth, Daydream Nation, namely, the jackknife inside of the dream, reminds me, perhaps one reason I dropped out of my history and philosophy degree at Leeds Uni in 2007 was that I was completely benignly, predictably inspired by such profound, benignly dreamy, dopamine-infused lyrics, but somehow also knew that they would be deemed the very mark of intellectual imbecility if they ended up in any kind of submitted university essay. Predictable stuff, you might say. However, as the London Review of Books said in 1980 in a review of several books about Napoleon, "What's that? I hear you cry. The lad has dropped out of a history and philosophy degree, and yet then has the temerity to then read a book review in a sometimes almost hallucinatory highfalutin literary magazine, tasked with reviewing several books about Napoleon. In one word, predictable stuff, you might say. But then again, Napoleon was a predictable general, and he achieved big things in his life, even if I categorically disagree with his unattractive brand of politics. Indeed, additionally, it's a truism that the autistic mind loves such facts like Napoleon was a predictable general, just as much as in most walking manifestations of the autistic brain, it will never in a million years be able to write an entire critics barbed wires robust podcast about Napoleon. But as the great Gustave Flaubert once said, contradiction is what holds sanity in place. That is the plan at any rate. See below. At any rate, in the 2015 book Neurotypes, The Legacy of Autism and How to Think Smarter About People Who Think Differently, there is reference to the subdepartment of psychology called psychometrics, essentially an example of testing any acquiescing individual's various aptitudes and their various impairments. Knowing the factoid that Napoleon was a predictable general is, as the popular saying goes, worth the price of admission, vis-a-vis desiring to acquire the status as someone possessing a bona fide amateur interest in history. Or, as Morrissey, before he left the band and became reprehensibly and needlessly right-wing during his solo career, when, that is to say, he was still in the Smiths, well, as he said about a sublime Mancunian funfair, the grease in the hair of the speedway operator is all a tremulous heart requires. Swoon. Now, that's also a great example of the meaning of the debatably underused phrase, worth the price of admission. So then, on the one hand, the popular English phrase, worth the price of admission, and on the other hand, the partially esoteric 1980s British indie music subculture latest lyrical highlight. Again, what Max Weber would call a polar concept. In short, if you understand one, then you understand the other. Furthermore, good old Max Weber, he said, didn't he, during his famous 1917 sociology essay, Science as a Vocation, somewhat somberly, he was once described as a somber prophet. Like, if he was on Tinder, it would read like, "Hi, my name's Max Weber. On the street, they call me a sick guy because I'm a wannabe post-jack of all trades dude. In academia land, they call me sometimes a somber prophet." At any rate, in that famous essay, Science as a Vocation, Weber, proving his nickname to be rather an accurate one, said that if a young student is hoping to embark on a career in science, be it physical or the social variety, then he or she must put on blinkers. That is a very sad statement, in my opinion. After all, several generations later, leading British cum international sociologist Anthony Giddens, in his 1982 book Profiles and Critiques in Social Theory, says, tantalizingly, 10 years is a long time in sociology. Insofar as vis-a-vis Adam Curtis' interesting idea that academia often stunts and limits the imagination of its participants, which is not to say that my imagination works in an exemplary fashion, far from it, as any honest, however charitable watcher of this video can, I'm sure, attest. Well, despite the then deeply felt heartbreak, still, in one word, I'm glad in a strange kind of way that I dropped out of Sheffield Hallam University in late 2022. And as they sometimes said on Guy Garvey's show on BBC Six Music, and why am I telling you this? Because you need to know. Or, as Albert Einstein once said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, imagination encircles the world. Or, further still, as they often used to say in the magnificent music department at Hayes School, the comprehensive school that had partial grammar school aspects to it in Bromley, South London, where I went to secondary school. Just wing it. They might indeed. And yet, we have previously referenced Marina Hyde and Richard Osman's podcast guest Adam Curtis's iridescent insight. There is no imagination in academia. And yet, what can I say? Just wing it. As an error-free piece of advice? Been there, done that, got the t-shirt is admittedly the sort of thing that could win the prize for contradicting Martin Amos's thesis in his obviously but importantly imaginative essay collection, The War Against Cliché, and yet, sometimes, despite everything, personal subjective examples are really useful when sometimes one feels overwhelmed with an exhaustive menu of pure abstract theoretical and intellectual terms. In other words, it is very hard to just wing it when you are faced with the excruciatingly exacting hyper-terminologically linguistic compositional demands for which sociology has long been infamous for. And this, an intermittently recurring inner rejection of pure abstract theoretical intellectual items coming from me, someone who knows quite what Hans Asperger meant when he said that many autistic people, generally speaking, have a, as he phrased it, preference for abstract content. Put in other words, rather than monetize things, I'd like to concretize things. Or as Susan Sontag once named an entire essay collection of hers, as consciousness hardens the flesh. At any rate, this being a tangent-themed YouTube video, I've slightly strayed from the point. In another Ron Seal does what it says on the tin style sub-Shakespearean aside. In one word, comrades, friends, and fellow travellers, when I was slogging away in that debatably imagination-limiting, even policing institution, Sheffield Hallam University, policing, how Orwellian of me, I'm sorry, it must be my left-leaning Communist Party but periphery frequenting family's influence, still not quite being shook off. Maybe one day. At any rate, what I'm driving at, as that most unlikely sociological conceptual bedfellow P.G. Woodhouse might phrase it, is that when I was slogging away at said higher education institution, I decided to email one of my teachers, Chris Fitzgerald. For on the one hand, I'd seen a video of his welcoming us to one particular sociological module of first year, level 4, in university parlance. On the other hand, I'd already become aware that this module would to a large extent be concerned with what might perhaps be described as practically entailing ethnography of a gym in Sheffield. Now, Marxists have long said that if there's a thesis, then there's inexorably, unstoppably going to be an antithesis and a synthesis. Who says Monty Python's "No one suspects the Spanish Inquisition" has passed its etiquette referential sell-by date? At any rate, this particular synthesis immediately led me to notice two further things. Firstly, that on the bookshelf in his office behind him, almost violently invisible in the video, good old Chris Fitzgerald had a copy of a book by Irvine Welsh. In the film Rain Man and the book Neurotypes, Raymond Babbitt is described by his brother Charlie as being someone about whom it could be veritably said. He notices things, the little things. At any rate, Irvine Welsh has long been one of my favourite writers. A poetic punk par excellence, you might call him. If, that is, you weren't scared of being labelled that most Welshian of things, a gobshite, by the great Scottish scribbler himself. At any rate, there I was, and suddenly several internal epiphanies all appeared in quick succession, like a sub-Shakespearean tragedy featuring a sort of more intellectually ambitious Carl Pilkington. Don't laugh. In other words, friends, on the one hand, I realised this whole ethnography on the gym in Sheffield proposition was going to be really colossally counterintuitive for yours truly, because, frankly, I've always been a geek and never been streetwise, and that, well, frankly, whenever I hear someone on the screen or in physical, palpable real life say they're going to the gym, I tend to reflexively think, okay, fair enough, it's their life, and boy do they look good after each sweaty session. However, frankly, probably, because I'm a stubborn geek, frankly, I'd rather go to that hypothetical paradisical place, the brain gym. So yeah, I thought about this, and images suddenly emerged in my mind, just as Balzac says about the effects of drinking coffee. Similes arise, and writing ceases to be a struggle. Internal images which, because of the prospect of the traditional gym, was so counterintuitive alien territory for me, theoretically and practically speaking, then, well, frankly, these internal images indicate that many would be the things that would be done, said, and seen there that would simply go straight over my head. I did not then realise that I also had ADHD. And then, bang, I had the epiphany that in due course, quickly and short, this particular sociology university teacher of mine would instantaneously, intensely deem me to be something of a no-hoper, or, as Muriel Sparks, Miss Jean Brodie describes some of her students, a duffer. In one word, friends, I synthesised the last few themes thusly, i.e., because multidimensional events in the gym would be going over my head, then, well, frankly, why should I not make an intellectually aspirational, genuine, self-deprecating joke about this? And so, this is what I said. I swiftly composed an email to Chris Fitzgerald, which started with, "Hi Chris, I notice you're a big Irvine Welsh fan. Me too. Over the years, I've enjoyed reading Trainspotting, Porno, Glue, and the Marabou Stalk Nightmares. Well, frankly, you may recall, Chris, that at the start of the follow-up to Trainspotting, namely Porno, Irvine Welsh goes full-on Steve Coogan on steroids. You know, controversial. And quotes that chronic overachiever Friedrich Nietzsche. Without cruelty, there is no festival. Bang! Just like that. With those few words, I'd soon learned that my reputation around the university's teachers and professors would be simply in tatters. For the next time that I saw him, at a seminar the following week, he looked at me with a palpable, "You're an idiot," look, and said, pointing at me, "We've had email contact." I'd somehow both answered and asked about 765 questions during the seminar, with the ADHD speciality, that is to say, with an almost alarming degree of unfiltered energy, the latter which, having concluded the catastrophic faux pas festoon Chris Fitzgerald anecdote, brings me nicely onto my next tangential yet partially logical topic, namely the relationship between punk rock music and ADHD. For in the YouTube video ADHD and Creativity, Kenny's story, Kenny Friedman talks about the links between punk rock and ADHD. The Guardian referred to fellow Scottish creators Mogwai's album Come and Die Young as promoting that most almost Irvine Welshian of activities, tune spotting. The first song on the album, Punk Rock, certainly possesses an example of Kenny's thesis of the intense and creativity enhancing connections between punk rock and ADHD. And this, I think, also taps into a particular form or expression of just those sort of understudied, uncelebrated aspects of ADHD, namely its people's inherent propensity to repeatedly seek dopamine that have long fascinated me. Yes, watching Kenny's video made me undulatingly inwardly glad someone who's been published on the internet has made reference to this most cherishable of relationships also. I've loved punk rock music precisely because of the heady dopamine rush that you often get, literally the millisecond after you start listening to it. Indeed, the great Lauren Laverne, who used to be in an underrated 1990s British indie punk band Kaniki, but has since gone into other organically likeable projects like hosting radio shows on BBC Radio 6 Music and beyond, once said on live daytime radio, proving that although sometimes the revolution won't be televised, at least sometimes the inner Bolshevik bohemian within Marconi might be jerked into action, swirling around serendipitously within him in his grave, namely, due to how she had said in a moment of pure Lavernian magic live on the captivating airwaves, referring to punk songs she just played, Proustian Rush. Swoon, and yet, sadly, swoon at such things as I might, it's still monumentally discouragingly true that in 2009, I was only able to achieve a grade D at AS level English language and literature, a failure experience at night school in Leeds after taxing teaching assistant shifts. However, somehow, I have retained a deep and devout love of literature and its attendant pastimes of reading, writing, and thinking aloud, the latter including sometimes speaking with a wannabe picturesque vociferousness about those powerful interconnected phenomena to many an unsuspecting bystander in Yorkshire, where, at 38, I've now lived a majority of my life, despite having learned most of my lingo in London. Which brings me nicely back to Lauren Laverne's commendable piece of intellectually ambitious broadcasting, namely the on-air, mass audience directed reference to those sometimes most tragically languishing, unreceived in the university archives of things, Proustian rushes. For everyone knows that Proust was, unlike me, despite my very best efforts, a great writer. Although almost as many people know that Proust wrote In Search of Lost Time, one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, effectively from his bedroom. The Guardian, habitual commentators of all things Lauren Laverne, punk rock and beyond related, said in the previous decade about the Proust influenced Kerouac that many of his novels were written attractively and dramatically on the run. I like that. No, scrub that. I really like that. But Lauren Laverne got there first. Proustian rush. What a phrase! Which reminds me, Melvin Bragg, in his underrated novel Crossing the Lines, speaks about fellow dopamine addict Kerouac. Kerouac, who also said, a great tea head of time like Proust. Tea, for the record, being a now hackneyed slang phrase for smoking cannabis. At any rate, in that book, Melvin Bragg says about On the Road, despite the criticisms, but what a sound! Of course, as everyone knows, the relationship between music and literature has always been a fantastically fecund one. Will Self, himself heavily influenced by William Burroughs, the latter who is referenced in John Cooper Clarke's extraordinary documentary on Thomas De Quincey. Mr. De Quincey, who J.C. Clarke, with effortless streetwise nonchalance, calls the original literary dope fiend. At any rate, Will Self says, the high arts of literature and music stand in a curious relationship to one another, at once securely comfortable and deeply uneasy, rather like a long-term marriage. William Blake once wrote a poem called The Marriage Between Heaven and Hell. Well, if you've had a bad day at the office with the old quill and inkpot trade, that is to say, a bad day at the office vis-a-vis the in terms of psychologically pointedly intriguing in terms of physically drudgery, all too marathonesque wannabe writing game, then you can also always find solace, and perhaps even metaphorically recharge batteries with an evening of music. Hence we have strayed onto the minutiae of certain writers' daily rituals type conceptual semantic field terrain, so to speak. W.H. Auden, after all, once said, "Routine in a man is a sign of ambition." However, obviously but importantly, the relationship between music and literature is not just a purely technical, occupational stamina issue. No, because, again, obviously but importantly, if you consider the history of literature, then, well, the music of Beethoven can be heard, almost, in the writing of Balzac. The music of the likes of Louis Armstrong and even Kurt Weill can be heard, almost, in the writing of F. Scott Fitzgerald. No explicitly intended reference to Chris Fitzgerald for the record. The nomenclature alignment here being purely accidental and arbitrary. And the music of Miles Davis and Charlie Parker can be heard, almost, in the writing of Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs. And, as a nice coincidence has it, Bob Dylan, after all, once said, "Take what you have gathered from coincidence." Martin Amis, in his 1973 novel The Rachel Papers, offers tips for aspiring writers, perhaps less cryptic, long-term writerly enterprise rise, the Kerouacs in some contexts, excruciating cryptic utterance, first thought, best thought. For he says, first you free associate, then you spot the jigsaw puzzle, then you piece the jigsaw puzzle together. Simple stuff, surely. Piss easy procedure, perhaps. Well, yes, in theory, yes, but in practice, far more a recipe, see below, for that universal human experience that T.S. Eliot once observed and articulated in his poetry by way of saying, between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. I suppose that's similar to what he meant when he said, during his also modernist poem The Wasteland, your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. Or, in our post-T.S. Eliot era, come the chiming of a certain evening hour, time to whack on another punk LP and hope to live to fight another day. In Christopher Hitchens' 2010 book, Hitch 22, Martin Amis is described as arguing that an apt term for the particular writer's variation on the general psychological term psychometrics. In other words, the term concerned with whether or not people have what it takes to persist and not give up, vis-a-vis the writerly craft in all its kaleidoscopic forms, is seaworthiness. I certainly like and rely on punk rock music a lot to not throw in the towel and go back to being a reader and watcher of high culture and low culture, rather than the producer of it. And yet, Martin Amis was never really associated, explicitly, deeply symbiotically involved with the various punk music scenes that exploded with a benign 12-dimensional exponentiality in primarily Britain and America in the 1970s, the latter multi-state domain where Iggy Pop was, with impish yet muscular iconoclastic gestures, smearing herself with peanut butter live on stage. I'll expand on this theme later, thanks. Now, one reason Martin Amis wouldn't be caught doing that was because his dad, Kingsley Amis, once published a thinly veiled fictional diatribe against various aspects of the emerging post-hippie culture of the late 1960s called Girl 20. However much, around the time of the publication of the Rachel Papers, he was dubbed by some the enfant terrible of English fiction. However, the same could hardly be said for William Burroughs, who, unlike Jack Kerouac, robustly survived the 1960s. For numerous punk bands such as Patti Smith Group and the Sex Pistols claim a deep, profound, dopamine-inflected debt of gratitude to the great sophisticated, effervescent dopamine junkie William Burroughs. Indeed, Kenny's thesis about punk rock and ADHD might house opportunities for exploring many cunning cul-de-sacs relating to William Burroughs' pre-1970s famous formulation of the cut-up technique that have not previously been investigated here. Indeed, it is true that with this particular piece of writing, I am submitting to a neurodiverse digital come real-world milieu, a milieu which includes ADHD as among the core disorders possessed by its members. I hope it helps to help improve their all-round writing game if they are aspiring writers. However, although it makes for good material to write about and good music to write about, sometimes punk and ADHD is the combination that allows you to have good, clean, healthy fun in public. Like, I admit that I often break into renditions of that stirring punk classic, Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen. You know, God Save the Queen, a fascist regime. I suppose it's what Scottish band Orange Juice during their record Rip It Up, called the to some people exasperating, to some people enjoyable, social phenomena. I'll spoil your party with my punky sneer. Although strictly speaking, the jackknife inside of the Dream Studies, Orange Juice were strictly a post-punk rather than a punk outfit, in terms of their widely held by consensus genre domain, so to speak. Or, again, as Sigmund Freud once said, the narcissism of minor differences. Fucking splitters. Which reminds me, I haven't referenced Trotskyism for a long time in this piece of writing, which, for the record, is strange, because sometimes I so often quote Trotskyism, it's a bit like that underrated moment in Richard Seymour's book on Jeremy Corbyn, concerning, firstly, where he says, underselling it, i.e., read particular ADHD, impulsive burnout, painful to recall memories. In other words, once deep within a post-Trotskyist period of your life, you're always, in some senses, a recovering Trotskyist. However, although there is an almost seemingly 12-dimensional disparaging social atmosphere that inevitably follows around most 16-year-old Trotskyist converts, as I was back in 2003, nevertheless, as even a somewhat docile imagination entailing act of contemplation will, I'm sure, in many contexts attest, becoming a Trotskyist of 16 immediately and automatically cranks into a high gear one's appreciation of that great ADHD mecca-like genre of music, punk rock, and in all its sprawling rainbow dopamine subgenres and subgenres too. For Blondie, she and they too, just like the Sex Pistols and Orange Juice, are part of this aforesaid great ADHD mecca. Now, neatly enough, in my opinion, David Foster Wallace is a notorious, celebrated, depending on your point of view, multiple footnotes at the end of his classic, unput down of a 1994 novel Infinite Jest, are seemingly very much a product of a partially ADHD cognitive style, insofar as, like the aforesaid Adam Curtis, although perhaps Foster Wallace flew even higher in his intellectual contribution with Infinite Jest than even Adam Curtis does in the aforesaid podcast, Adam Curtis on the BBC Politics and AI. Sorry, mate. However, on the plus side, at least you didn't end up committing suicide. Although, to be fair to both of them, Foster Wallace was what, in that particular dual context, he was in that context working on a far larger canvas. Infinite Jest footnotes, or perhaps a profound, affecting example of how fresh synthesis could be made, namely, that between Curtis's concept of there is no imagination allowed in academia and the old English phrase, if you can't beat them, join them. Just putting it out there. Indeed, in such an academic arena as Curtis's dystopian imagination-stunted realm, Foster Wallace's eccentrically endearing footnotes would be dismissed as both a denial of Michael Foucault's thesis, The Death of the Author, as well as a denial of elementary academic aesthetics-related, if it can be called that, etiquette, just proving, paradoxically enough, that poor old Foster Wallace, attacked by the literary intellectuals, i.e. attacked by Harold Bloom as having no talent, what the fuck, still managed to, both dialectically and paradoxically, achieve an endnotes-equipped example of what Harold Bloom, perhaps far more persuasively and unerroneously, once called the autonomy of the aesthetic. In short, if you write a serious, savagely comic novel with serious, savagely comic footnotes, then perhaps it's true to say that you have been labouring in the field that debatably, conceivably has written upon its entrance sign, the parallel opposite of the Italian Dante, and Dante more the beautiful Beatrice chasing than forever dopamine chasing for its own sake type of literary lad, and his own dystopian descriptive realm. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. That is to say, if you have been labouring in the field that's written on its entrance sign, the autonomy of the aesthetic land, where ADHD cognitive profile individuals roam freely, then you can have truly acquired a permanent permit to Harold Bloom's independent imaginative domain, the autonomy of the aesthetic. What can I say? Guns N' Roses, in the decade of my birth, the 1980s, wrote a devastatingly rollicking song, not unrelated to Dante's timeless Odyssey, to win over the beautiful Beatrice, called Paradise City. And in our own decade, I truly love YouTube. Indeed, again, elsewhere in the 1994 book, The Western Canon, Howard Bloom alludes to my mind, tantalizing phrase of literary criticism namely aesthetic dignity. Indeed, I say this not only because my biological mum, Sarah Ward, died when I was 1 year old, and I have always regarded her as a muse of sorts. Dante was wrong. You can be forever chasing your own necessarily unique version of the ethereal sexy Beatrice, as well as chasing good old rapidly entire universe inflected dopamine for its own sake, or as they don't quite say in your standard teenage football training session, fuck the woman, not the dissolvable false dichotomy. Anyway, but Dante was absolutely not wrong insofar as another literary critic, Frank Kermode, who reviewed Harold Bloom's Western canon in the London Review of Books in 1994, the same year that Infinite Jest came out, and was reviewed this time favourably by another literary critic, James Wood, in The Guardian. At any rate, the literary critic Frank Kermode once, in his 1957 book Romantic Image, said, again with tantalising tenderness, with an Olympian stimulation of affection, every girl is a poem. Swoon. YouTube is a place where always serious, but sometimes, who knows, occasionally benignly sultry feminists achieve what Harold Bloom called aesthetic dignity, and Karl Marx would call one specific form of species being. After all, Dave Foster Wallace's biography by D.T. Max is entitled Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, and Harold Bloom, again paradoxically and dialectically, in the book The Western Canon, alludes to the romance of reading. For I am both haunted by and rendered happy due to a fresh hallucinatory state, vis-a-vis the ephemeral emergence of the ghost of my late mother, Sarah Ward, whenever I watch a YouTube video of a typically well-read, wonderful woman. Yes, reading and writing, when done to the best of one's abilities, can be akin to Bloom's spirit-nourishing formulation, the romance of reading. And again, I'm still completely aware that unlike Purple Ella, Yosemite-san, Kenny Friedman, Foster Wallace, Bloom, Kermode, and Wood, I'm not a genius, but a blend of low-functioning autism as well as high-functioning autism. ADHD is just one of the tools in my toolkit to help me try to, firstly, mask, and secondly, even less plausibly, mitigate some of my low-functioning permanent cognitive style issues. And they are big issues, man. Indeed, it is precisely because I can't really write like my heroes such as Purple Ella and co. and Foster Wallace and co. that I often choose to find solace in writing about good old ADHD-friendly punk rock. For, although Elvis Costello, also more of a post-punk figure than a punk figure, once said, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. Nevertheless, not only is it true that the great sympathetic music critic Alex Ross is never likely to be seen grouching around the perimeter of the New York equivalent of a Job Centre Plus, it is also true that trying to describe quite why punk rock feels so ecstatic is often an enterprise that will ensure you walk away from the metaphorical rendezvous with the distinct impression that all the debatable fat punk music tends to speak to the more intensely emotional rather than intensely intellectual aspects of ADHD. Nevertheless, great punk music always does have an intensely intellectual aspect to the fabric of its deep, frame-shaking, to punkishly paraphrase proto-literary dope fiend because original oft-opium and imagination-indulging fiend Samuel Taylor Coleridge joys, so to speak. For example, during the song Smiling at Strangers on Trains by the modern punk band Million Dead, although, again, just proving that it is undeniable that punk, although a cohesive genre-based term, has from its first swaggering bar chord possessed nth-degree subgenres. More accurately, during the song Smiling at Trains on Strains by the Strangers on Trains even, by the post-hardcore band Million Dead, they talk tantalizingly of somehow celluloid-inflected similes such as like a million different Mighty movies. For if we take this song how similarly to be the case, and we therefore think that Million Dead's poetic punk statement here has ensured that it is benignly ineradicable from the sprawling 12-dimensional rolling, roiling discourse, then it follows that it, coupled with a simultaneous contemplative glance at, firstly, John Luke Gollard's phrase, photography is truth, cinema is truth 24 times per second, and secondly, that underrated moment in Irish novelist Sebastian Barry's novel, The Secret Scripture, in one sense, everyone's life is like a film, then it follows that perhaps Elvis Costello, once ironclad in its opposite of being a straw man argument credentials, writing about music is like dancing about architecture, seems, well, suddenly slightly vulnerable to the charge of being a straw man argument. Well, answers on a postcard, please, so to speak. I've certainly often loved nothing more than to the accompaniment of what sometimes seems nothing less than the ultimate medicine, music, writing to and occasionally reading letters from good friends, just like they do in Mike Leigh movies, and movies by other, almost dangerously likable directors also. The same applies, however, to potential imminent interaction on YouTube comments and various social media DMs from my perspective. In other words, I guess I'm the chronic fanboy who wants to forever remain a fanboy, but perhaps at some point acquire some non-sycophantic, obviously, but seriously sympathetic, hopefully, fans of his own. At any rate, in the aforesaid Irvine Welsh's novel Porno, Irvine Welsh depicts his almost post-proletarian protagonist Francis Begbie, upon suddenly finding himself staring into the eyes of his seeming love of lifetime stalwart, reliably left-leaning lover, saying, "But when I looked into her Barry face, I knew that everything would be all right." Now, I'll expand on this Barry face theme later on in the video. However, for the time being, regarding this whole "but when I looked into her Barry face" business, well, frankly and generally speaking, the propulsive thriller punk music's ADHD aspects is a bit like that. It has the excitement of romance and sex, without much of the John Paul Sartre "hell is other people"-esque hassle. The latter a gnomic, nightmarish maxim that was conceived in the context, I admit, far, far, of course, from the sticky, snakeable, besmirched indie disco mecca dance floors, where my 20-something self, the latest attempt at wooing a wonderful woman, foiled by my flirtatious incompetence again, sometimes brooded similarly to the great Sartre. Um, at any rate, the great flawed Niccolo Machiavelli, obviously but importantly, said, "The ends justify the means." Karl von Clausewitz once said, "War is politics by other means." In his anthropological work of the French scientific scene, Laboratory Life, Bruno Latour makes fascinating, fanatical reference to those telling types of phrases that such scientists often deploy when in and active in the laboratory. Military metaphors, he said. And last but not least, Bob Dylan once said, during the song Idiot Wind, "In the final end, he won the wars after losing every battle." Every dopamine mission's conclusion ends in a minor, devastating anticlimax, which has in its train nothing but depression, brooding, and work ambivalence lethargy. However, of- how- of, uh, this never quite leaves one as long as one keeps working. So then, we can conclude Machiavelli was in many contexts right to claim that sometimes the ends justify the means. But additionally, Leon Trotsky, once called a military genius by Krista Richards on YouTube, he certainly read his Machiavelli, once said, of good old Aula Minerva theory coiner and popularizer GFW Hegel, if the physical and the end product can be called tableau friendly, quote, "the transformation of quantity into quality, the most important law of dialectical logic." And so, therefore, we can conclude this latest riff, to borrow a term from punk rock, and indeed prog rock, etc., is that sometimes Machiavelli was premature in cutting off his maxim in the way he did. For, in light of all that's recently been said, is it not true to say that sometimes, if ADHD centers to life practitioners have anything to do with it, at any rate, sometimes the dopamine saturated means directly ensure that there aren't any dopamine saturated ends in the first place? Or should that be the final analysis place? Again, answers on a postcard, please, so to speak. Which reminds me, Trotsky, although also once said, in his underrated article, The ABC of Materialist Dialectics, the relationship between formal logic and dialectical logic is roughly that between lower mathematics and higher mathematics. And yet, I think it would be premature to say that Trotsky had ADHD, or, as his great flawed collaborator Lenin was once described by my then comrade Kitty Rees from Wakefield, Yorkshire. I was then a relatively orthodox Bolshevik. Now I am an intermittently unorthodox Bolshevik sympathising, permanent bohemian stalwart practitioner. There is a difference. At any rate, she said, truly I think, that Lenin was, for all of his intelligence, a bit of a Puritan. Of course, this leads back to the old psychological studies bogeyman about whether it is possible to have a pure thought. Here, unlike in other contexts, i.e., Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, does not have subjectively equally called an argumentative position going its way. It's convincing, I think, to argue. A firm adherence to a policy of moral relativism is the healthy and happy interpretation of said events in question, so to speak. For who's to say that a non ADHD writer like Trotsky is right or wrong, and that an ADHD writer like Kenny is right or wrong? And yet, although it's rarely not without risk to one's desire to avoid cognitive dissonance, to reference Freud, nevertheless, although I respect Trotsky in many senses, nevertheless, sometimes I'm deeply glad to possess that priceless ADHD advantage of such a lifelong desire to have 12-dimensional, sweetly simultaneous, another hit on the bong like fun. And here's where ADHD studies again benignly, beautifully crosses over with autism studies, so to speak. For dialectically and paradoxically, just as there are those events and venues where many autistic people fear to tread, i.e., full-on Dionysian proposition, that is to say, raves, nevertheless, it still follows that just as there is to be found on certain almost hermetic, solipsistic bohemian corners of the internet, memes such as "Gurn with Pride," drugging choice here, obviously, but importantly, Ash's House instigator MDMA. Nevertheless, in similar corners of the internet can also be found stim with pride memes, because sometimes an ADHD instantaneous, fleeting yet noggin nourishing dopamine mission can generally possess palpable, simultaneously occurring autism studies related stim with pride characteristics. Or as the Smashing Pumpkins start one of their music videos during the song Stand Inside Your Love, quoting Oscar Wilde, coiner of the phrase, the easiest way to deal with temptation is to yield to it. Well, they start that particular music video with the phrase, the mystery of love is greater than the mystery of death. Swoon. Nah. No, but it is a genuine swoon, right? Anyway, for again, as Soren Kierkegaard said, almost anticipating a potential renaissance in ADHD studies in the mid-21st century, man is condemned to live life forwards and review it backwards. For, of course, if you have ADHD, after most impulsive actions, particularly those that concern bamboozling, innocent and hardy ADHD needs fanatic strangers in the street, the marketplace, bus stop, and so on. It follows that you do that most Kierkegaardian of things, review the life that has just been lived, and well, frankly cringe, and cringe again. Yes, the next impulsive dopamine-seeking mission is never far away. Or as Marx and Engels once said, everything is solid melts into air. Sonic Youth, during the end of the ADHD because Punk and Kerouac influenced album Daydream Nation, sing 10 years and they haven't turned up anything. Well, everyone knows that perhaps more than most other medical conditions, ADHD are chronic underachievers in certain professional classificatory contexts. I too may remain for the rest of my life among such a milieu. However, what if after, say, 10 years, you could do the contrary to what is so memorably depicted in the Sonic Youth lyric, song and video? What if you could, turn up something? What if you could contribute something back to the very culture that spawned you, educated you, inspired you, irritated you, mocked you, frustrated you? Well, as that great partially ADHD figure, Oscar Wilde, has a character say during the start of his 1891 novel, Picture of Dorian Gray, the only novel he ever wrote, fucking ADHD, only joking, days in summer are apt to linger. Well, that is the hope, at any rate. And hope is a priceless commodity. For on the one hand, again, as that very neurodiverse figure saying, very neurodiverse thing, Albert Einstein once said, imagination is more important than knowledge, for it encircles the world. And on the other hand, as Jack Kerouac says in On the Road, life is holy and every second is precious, which can be extended benignly even further by internally alighting on something David Foster Wallace once said, namely, what happens in a moment. He meant, I think, what happens in the internal fizzing maelstrom of a moment. Or again, as British international sociologist Anthony Giddens once said in his 1982 collection, Profiles and Critiques in Social Theory, 10 years is a long time in sociology. Of course, I no longer want to be a sociologist, However, on the one hand, the great Erasmus once wrote a book called In Praise of Folly, and as if that wasn't enough, to seek and acquire and utilize what John Harris in his 2015 Guardian piece on the some minds misnamed journal Marxism Today, The Comforts of Self-Help, well, that contender along with De Quincey for the original literary Dopamine Prize, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, stretched this eternity-touching theme even further when he completed an even, in many senses, very poetic and profound work, Dejection and Ode. And yet we can go further, ADHD punk rock dopamine missions being never far away. For the Manic Street Preachers once completed a song called Love Sweet Exile. Ah, speak of a sweet, sweet dopamine dripping synthesis of my Levantine cover, or we have all the time in the world, and William Wordsworth's bliss was it to be alive in that dawn, but to be young was very heaven. Or, as G.K. Chesterton, another secret dopamine junkie, once said, during his, in T.S. Eliot's opinion, greatest ever biography of that great manic dopamine fiend, Charles Dickens. There is more of the spirit of the French Revolution in Nicholas Nickleby than there is in A Tale of Two Cities. And friends, A Tale of Two Cities is actually, plot to chart wise, as Foster Wallace in one of his essays is actually about the French Revolution. Or, as I once wrote in a notebook concerning that deviant, Howard S. Becker's notion of secondary deviance, when it comes to the secret dialectic between primary deviance and secondary deviance, primary deviance, in the final analysis, is for dilettantes. Of course, I am still a deluded dilettante, despite and because of still being an unemployed ADHD rightly comedian, and yet as OCD, dyspraxia, and bipolar disorder sufferer, yet sometimes utilises Samuel Johnson once said, and yet, still, I have hope. Indeed, the great Purple Ella, Yosemite Sam, and Kenny have for many months now been highly inspirational role models for my ADHD self. Which leads me neatly to my last point. Like many people, I had intense role models in my childhood years, as well as my teenage years. More specifically, firstly, from the age of 9 onwards, David Beckham and co. from the professional sports people industry bewitched my young mind significantly while still of a very tender age, principally by the ruthless proto-swaggering lads-mag-esque football-focused journalistic publication Match magazine, wherein the fictional journalistic character of Matchman was almost an Andrew Tate of his day and in that contrasting journalistic medium. Then, secondly, that quintessential teenage Bible Kerrang ensured that various rock stars such as the great Slash from Guns N' Roses replaced David Beckham as the most significant influence on my still relatively youthful mind. However, frankly, looking back at the period after I'd entered the Kerrang plus Slash from Guns N' Roses phase of heavily influenced personal come academic development, there was a complete lack of serious and accessible role models for reading and writing for me, as, again, looking back, there was for everyone else my age. Also, sadly, as when looking at said position of children and teenagers in late 2025, apart from, say, the intensely flawed figure of J.K. Rowling, let's just say I intensely disagree with her on the issue of what constitutes transphobia, but still think perhaps old Harold Bloom was being a bit harsh on her when he ruthlessly panned her first published book. Then again, what would you expect from a man whose favourite writer in the entire history of the world was Samuel Johnson, the latter whom David Foster Wallace, another victim of Mr. Bloom's powerful but sometimes dogmatic pen, in one of his essays, memorably I think, described Samuel Johnson as, lol, the original grammatical hard ass. At any rate, I digress. Where were we? That's right, the needlessly tragic lack of prominent role models for the underrated, difficult, but delightful activities of reading and writing for both children and teenagers in our current society. Well, as my sister Alice's favourite Mahatma Gandhi quote goes, be the change you want to see in the world. Well, here goes. In other words, if I could somehow eventually take my place alongside the great Purple Ella, the great Yosemite Sam, and the great Kenny as all ADHD and ADHD role models, then I'd be a very happy bunny indeed, as my dear mum Jane Ward would probably say. Which is not, for the record, to say that I'd advocate the mass whipping out and rhythmic use of rampant rabbits. I'm not that kind of deviant, when it comes to numerous forms of devices. Oh, okay. Even if, who knows, Jack Kerouac's idea and the fairly inwardly expressive roller coaster as positivity maelstrom happy midst on the road says that I knew that someday the pearl will be handed to me, and there will be girls, visions, everything needed in the fullness of time have 0% verisimilitude with regards to my potential career as a YouTuber influencer. And yet, although, as I previously said, I'm often inspired by numerous female friends and muses, starting with my mum, who died when I was 1 year old, and my other mum, who is thankfully still with us. But since primary school, sort of softly, metaphorically moving through numerous unsuspecting yet sympathetic girls and women of all sorts. Nevertheless, in my opinion, sometimes pursuing intense platonic, collaborative pleasure is even more holistically exciting than pursuing intense romantic consummation related pleasure and or intense sexual intercourse related pleasure. That's the way I currently see things, generally speaking, at any rate. Whatever the eventual outcome, I hope that people see my desire to be an influencer as being not unrelated to the theme of underrated books such as uh, The Meaning of the Creative Act, albeit in my disabled intellectual contextual version of Abraham Maslow's concept of self-actualization. Namely, although if you are lucky enough to devote your days to the rickety enterprise of being creative, and that this is a cardinally important form of success in and of itself, in a not unprofound manner, nevertheless, sometimes an audience is the thing. What can I say? Long live wannabe autistic and ADHD wordsmiths like me, but perhaps like some of you too, in all counties and countries. And well, from the very bottom of my heart, thank you so much for watching this video. And well, as Bruce Dickinson said, the end of many an Iron Maiden set across the temporal span of many a moon, so to speak. Thank you, and good night. See you soon, hopefully. Please do at least think about getting in touch with me via a comment on YouTube or via an email to benbolton1987 at AOL.com. That is benbolton1987 at AOL.com. Lots of love and solidarity. Ben. See you next time.